Thank you for that. My name is Audra Mesa. I am from the Orange County Department of Ed. I work as a literacy and language coordinator. I'm joined by my colleague.
My name is Rebecca Harrison. I'm the coordinator of academic interventions. So Audra and I work closely together to coordinate academic interventions in the area of literacy. We also both have personal and professional passion for equity, inclusion, and making sure that students feel represented in their literacy lessons and learning experiences. So that's what we hope to share with you today. Audra and I co-teach together quite a bit. This clicker is not working. Please hold. You have to turn it on. It's a lot like my oven. If you want it to cook something, you have to turn it on. Still not turning. Okay. There we go. So having read the description and read the title and chosen to come to this room at this time on this day, we kind of wanted you to take a moment to think about what it is about this session that brought you here and what is your goal that you hope to get out of this time. So just take a moment. You can write that down. You can think about it in your mind. You can share it in the chat if you're willing. We'd love to hear some out loud in this space. It helps us know how we can best meet your needs. So we'll take a moment, set that goal, share it in any way that you're comfortable, and then we'll get started officially in just a moment. And we'd love to hear from you. Would anybody want to share their goal, what brought you here to this particular session? Yes, all the way in the back, and then we'll come up here. Awesome. So it was shared looking for some tools to help teachers make those instructional shifts for our students. Absolutely. Thank you.
I honestly have been intrigued by the title, especially the words culturally and linguistically, being an English teacher.
Awesome. So some of the terminology, specifically culturally and linguistically relevant teaching. How do we universally design that? Thank you. So those are our goals today, literally to share with you some tools and some resources and even some actual experiences that we've had helping teachers make these shifts. Audra and I not only work together now, but we were also instructional coaches together in a district prior to coming to the county office. We still have a lot of relationship with teachers in that district, and they often let us come in and plan lessons with them, deliver lessons to their students. And so we're kind of hoping to get through some of the big theory information at the beginning so that we can get you right to that practical application, things that we have that teachers have created and evidence of students learning to show that some of the tools and the resources that we're going to be sharing with you today have actually made it to the classroom. I know sometimes we attend sessions and it kind of stays up here in the theory, but what does this actually look like in the classroom? So that's where we would like to take you today. As I started to say earlier, Audra and I co-teach together quite a bit on many, many different topics. And one thing that we have found that works well for us is that I will kind of present a lot of that theory, the frameworks, that grounding research. And then Audra's going to take it home and share with us some of that practical application, the things that we've been able to do with that theory and that research. So the first thing I'm going to share with you is the California MTSS framework. Are you guys familiar with the California MTSS framework? Yes. Okay. I see a lot of head nods and I see some head shaking. Part of my role with Orange County Department of Ed is we are the grant holder for the state of California for the implementation of California MTSS statewide. As such, Audra and I are both coaches, coaching schools through the implementation process. We work at both the local level and the state level, helping schools and districts across the state implement the California MTSS framework to build multi-tiered systems of support for their students. So this is the California MTSS framework. Across the top is the big orange whole child domain. This is the goal of our work as educators. It's what gets us out of bed every morning. The reason schools exist is because we want to create inclusive academic instruction for all students, inclusive behavior instruction and supports for all students, as well as inclusive, transformative social emotional instruction and mental health. And while they're listed out separately, the whole child domain suggests that these things are all integrated, that students' academic performance is not independent of their social emotional well-being, their mental health, and their behavior choices. The way we achieve those is through those blue essential support domains, including administrative leadership, integrated supports, family and community engagement, and inclusive policy, practice, and structure. The reason I share that with you is because universal design for learning and culturally and linguistically relevant teaching, the two pedagogies that our session is built on today, are specifically called out in the California MTSS framework under inclusive academic instruction and under the integrated supports domain. So when we are universally designing culturally and linguistically relevant lessons, we are part of building a multi-tiered system of support for all students. So here's a zoom in on that whole child domain. You'll see universal design for learning right here under inclusive academic instruction, as well as culturally and linguistically relevant teaching. All of this is built on a continuum of support, understanding that all students need different things at different times to different levels of intensity. So how are we able to articulate what it is that we provide to all students in the form of universal support? What do we have available for some students who need it in the form of supplemental support? And what do we provide to students, a few students who need it in the form of intensified support? So you'll see all of this terminology come up in the tools and the resources that we're going to share with you in just a moment. These are the UDL guidelines. Are we familiar with the UDL guidelines? Okay. Lots of nods again. So the UDL guidelines call for providing students with multiple means of engagement. How do I engage with my learning and who do I engage with? Multiple means of representation, voice and choice in how I receive information. And finally, multiple means of action and expression, options for how I demonstrate what I know and am able to do. Here under action and expression, where it says build fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance, this connects directly to that continuum of support. So how in our lessons are we providing opportunities for students to be where they are at on that continuum of learning? If the goal or the objective or the standard or the rigor is for all students to get to point D, how can we honor the students who are at point B and give them the supports that they need in order to arrive at that designated learning target? We can do that through optimizing the relevance, value, and authenticity of our lessons, heightening the salience of goals and objectives, helping students understand that the goals that they set for themselves to move along that continuum is what is going to get them to that ultimate learning target, as well as providing students with mastery-oriented feedback, helping them self-reflect and self-assess along the way, and helping them set those appropriate goals in the first place, while helping them support their planning and strategy development. And finally, enhancing their capacity for monitoring their own progress. I'm going through this very quickly because what Audra is going to share is way more interesting and important, but it's all of these pieces put together into the practical tools. So the way we layered in culturally and linguistically relevant teaching is based on the work of Zaretta Hammond. So Zaretta Hammond, in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, she takes a neurobiological perspective on when teachers are culturally responsive, how it creates neural pathways for students to be able to learn and achieve at higher levels. Or on the reverse, when we aren't culturally responsive, how we're actually creating cognitive overload for our students because they're having to manage the cultural differences and the content at the same time. So she published, the Ready for Rigor framework, which takes us through the 4 quadrants of being culturally and linguistically responsive. Sorry, I need water.
Doing great.
Thank you. It's so hard to present with a math
theory in like 15 minutes.
Right,
I'm like,
right.
she can do it. She can
With
do
the
it.
mask
I've seen it.
back on.
I know. Okay. Back to professional Rebecca. Hold on. Okay, she's back. So the first one starts with awareness. Understanding our own cultural lens, our own cultural identity, and being able to recognize and appreciate and value that in others, particularly our students. This quadrant up here, the upper right-hand quadrant, is those learning partnerships, reimagining the teacher-student relationship and disrupting any power dynamics that might exist within those relationships. Here, honoring the community of learners and the learning environment. This has to do with the relationship between the students, disrupting any power dynamics that might exist between the relationships of the students, as well as what is valued, honored, and represented on the walls of our classrooms. And then finally, information processing, teaching students in such a way that we are building what she calls their intellective capacity, their ability to learn and comprehend at high levels. And so we took all of this information, universal design for learning, multi-tiered system of support, culturally and linguistically relevant teaching, and we said, what are the essential components that teachers need to include in their lessons in order to be universally designing culturally and linguistically relevant instruction that is going to be inclusive of all students in their classrooms. And these are the components. First, establish and communicate a learning goal that is student-centered and student-driven. Allowing folks time for collaboration. Allowing people to have individual strategies for how they will achieve that goal. A discussion of their strategies and a co-construction of knowledge, and then finally the opportunity to transfer that to a new and novel situation. So the way this looks in math, because you can see here how it looks in literacy development, and Audra's going to walk through that in just a moment. But in math, it means that at the beginning of class, I'm going to establish that goal. Here's what I'm going to be teaching today. Where do you see yourself in that learning goal? What is it that you hope to push yourself towards today? A mathematical problem and then allowing students time to talk through it. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm wondering. Here's how I might approach this problem. And then allowing students to go attack that problem in the way that makes the most sense to their thinking. And then coming back together and talking about what happened when you went to solve that math problem. Did you solve it? Did you struggle? Did you make mistakes? What mistakes did you make? What did you learn from those mistakes? It's not about right or wrong. It's about learning. And then once we've had that discussion of strategies and a co-construction of knowledge, now let's go back and try that on a new and novel math problem. I might not go back and solve it the same way I did the first time. I might really like the way you solved it. And so now I'm going to go back and try it the way you did it, and that's going to build my knowledge and my understanding. The way that looks in literacy development is here on the slide, and I'm not going to walk you through it because Audra's going to actually walk you through it with some very concrete examples from some amazing lessons that we got to do with some 4th grade students last year.
She did it. She got through decades and decades of theory to give us some background and some context to all of this work. And so the one thing that I will say to sort of bridge us from the theory to the application is when you have time. And again, Rebecca and I could do like 4 hours of stand-up on this topic. So when we were limited to 60 minutes, we were like, oh no. But once you actually take the time to go through all of these frameworks that we discussed, you start to see the overlap. You start to see the connections on what we're talking about in the MTSS framework and all of those pieces there. And I think it's so helpful to see those connections, because then when you actually start doing the work, you're like, oh, this is when we say like, oh, I'm touching on that element of MTSS, or oh, I can see the connection to the Ready for Rigor framework. So you have all of those pieces there. So we'll get some time to go through and actually look at those pieces, and hopefully you'll see those connections as well to all of the things that we were talking about and how that gets done and how students are actually able to do that work. The one thing that I will say that you can take from Dr. Zaretta Hammond's work, the brilliance of it, but one of the things that she always says is like, you have to make some ugly pancakes, right? So like the first pancakes don't always look the best. So when we start designing this and we start putting this together, we had to figure out like, where are we gonna go and how are we gonna make these ugly pancakes? Because Rebecca and I sit here in theory and design, like this is how you would bring it all together. And so we reached out to some incredible educators that we used to work with in our former district, like Rebecca shared, and just asking them for us to have the opportunity to go in their classroom and try this out. Make some ugly pancakes, see if this works. How do we actually take this lesson planning template and move it into tangible action? So if you're following along at home, we already put the link to the bit.ly in the chat. If you're with us in person, it's actually there in the first slide in the slide deck. But this is the theoretical template that we came up with to kind of walk us through all of those frameworks put together into practice. And so what we did is we sort of took these resources here at the top, the anti-bias framework, which comes from Learning for Justice, the artist formerly known as Teaching Tolerance. Also looking at perspectives for a diverse American curriculum planner. And then again, like Rebecca mentioned, the Universal Design for Learning Guidelines. And so we started walking through how we would go and actually incorporate the things that we would do as part of our normal lesson plan. The standards, what we began today, what's your goal for being here, right? What's our instructional target for students? What's the essential question that we're asking students? So one of our schools is a STEAM magnet, project-based learning. So they're really grounded around essential questions. The other school has an adopted curriculum where every unit begins with essential questions. So really looking for those ties into what teachers were actually teaching. And then looking at the individual learning targets for UDL. And so we kind of went through, that's not a touch screen. So we kind of went through and then had some conversations around what text selection could look like. And so Rebecca started talking about how we work together often and that we both have a passion for equity. Absolutely. Mine is definitely centered around diverse texts for our students and giving them opportunities, just like we've heard today in our two wonderful keynote speakers. How do we get students to see themselves, not only in the world, but their place in our curriculum, their place in our community? So really having conversations with the teachers of like, how are we gonna pick texts that is going to add to this culturally responsive lesson that we're going to design using the UDL framework. And then we also had some conversations around assessments. I think sometimes when we think assessments, because of our experience, our brain goes to like a multiple choice, exit ticket sort of summative assessment. But really, the key piece being that in this work, we know that it's not just a one and done lesson. So what is the assessment going to look like after day one? What is the assessment going to look like after day two? How do we check in to see that students are making progress? And then we looked at tasks that we wanted students to do. What are they, if we know the domains of listening, speaking, reading, and writing, how are we going to give students opportunities to do all of those things, even if it's not in this one particular activity, but as they move through their time together with this lesson? And then sort of looking at strategies that we wanted to use, and I think one of the key pieces was anticipated student needs. because that really opened up a whole conversation of what are the things that students are going to need. And sometimes I think when we think of the word need, we're like, oh, well, this one's going to need scaffolding for reading. And this one's going to need a partner to help with vocabulary. But some of the things that we also talked about is that students are going to need room to work on their posters. Students are going to need opportunities to be loud and share their ideas. Students are going to need. So just framing that anticipated student need piece was really important because it let us have a greater understanding of what success would look like for our students, keeping in mind, as Rebecca took us through, the UDL framework, and then how do we layer in those opportunities to be culturally responsive to our students. All right, so I'm gonna go back up here. I'm in so many windows and tabs. So if you click that bit.ly at the top, it's gonna take you to a share folder. And in that share folder, where it's just everything's in there. You'll never come to a session with Audra and Rebecca and be like, I wish they'd given us more resources. Absolutely not. We're going to give you, if anything, too many resources. So in that lesson plan piece, you'll actually be able to go through and see the actual lesson plans that teachers constructed. So I sort of took you through that overview template. Now you can go through and see they've done the work, right? These are educators who understand what their content standards are. But in our effort to have conversations and instruction related to cultural relevancy, we also looked at the social justice standards, and they looked at identity. And so there's standards for students, and these are 4th and 5th grade students in a combination class, and then 5th grade students in 2 classes at another school site, that students will recognize that people's multiple identities interact and create unique and complex individuals. And then next one is students will express pride, confidence, and healthy self-esteem without denying the value and dignity of other people. And so you can see that as you go through these, they looked at instructional targets, but teachers also really spent some time looking at those essential questions for their 4th and 5th grade students. So for 4th grade, what do we learn when we look at the world through the eyes of others? Was their guiding question. And then for 5th grade, how can other perspectives help us evaluate the world? So now let's get to the fun stuff. What are the books? What's the text that we actually went through and read? So for those of you who don't know, us coming from Orange County, so much of the civil rights movement and the work that was done towards having equity in our schools was actually born in Orange County. If you think about that, oftentimes folks will cite Brown versus the Board of Education. But prior to Brown versus the Board of Education is a little less known law or legal case of Mendez versus Westminster. And so in this effort, the students read text that was related to that court case. One of them is a book called Separate is Never Equal by Duncan Tonatu, so more of like a picture book. And then they also paired that with another text called Sylvia and Aki, which is more of a traditional chapter book written by Winifred Conklin. So students had the opportunity to work through different types of texts. There were different forms of assessment, things that they were being asked to do, and the different tasks that they were given based on it being a picture book versus it being more of a traditional chapter book. So that's kind of the overview. I'm like, how did I do, Rebecca? What did I miss?
We really want you guys to be able to see the student work and the things that came out of this. And the only thing I'll add
Please.
while you click around.
From an academic intervention perspective, when we were talking about those anticipated student needs, we knew there were going to be students in that class that struggled with the rigor of those texts. And so we had a lot of conversations with the teachers about how do we prepare to scaffold that learning for those students so they could still access the same text. But we did it from a perspective of just in case, when oftentimes teachers do things from a perspective of just in time. So what it means is kind of like the keynote was saying this morning, when we say, oh, well, a student can only read at a third grade level, and so we give them third grade level books, we're never pushing them towards accessing those texts that are more complex. So what we did was we talked to those teachers and we said, what about this text might make it challenging? We pulled out some of those multisyllabic words. The teachers were prepared to pull a small group and give them some small group instruction around the multisyllabic words that were in the text. But they were prepared to do it just in case. But they didn't automatically pull those students and do it just because they thought those students might need it. So it's a very slight difference. It's knowing your students and knowing what they might need and being prepared to do it, but not just doing it automatically. And so as those students accessed those texts and they decided who they wanted to work with, what we found was that many of the students didn't actually need the supports that we had planned because they were learning from their peers, they were engaged in the text. As they heard fluent readers reading that out loud, they were actually picking up much more than they were when the teacher was pulling them into the small group.
Absolutely. So what we're going to do now is we're going to give you like 15 minutes just to kind of dive through all of these resources. Again, in the spirit of UDL, you'll have the opportunity to decide how you want to interact. Maybe you just want to go to those lesson plans and strategically look through what those teachers have planned out for that particular content. So in there, you'll see their lesson plans, additional lesson plans, resources that they pulled from. If you're like, wait a minute, you told me you went into a classroom and you guys actually did this work with students, I wish we could see some student work samples, then that photo section is definitely going to be where you want to go through. And again, like we shared, this isn't just a one-day activity. So there's lots of lessons that went on in there. So there was a picture walk that some of the teachers did in anticipation to get students ready for sort of the historical context and sort of the heavy content that they were going to be talking about in terms of the Mendez versus Westminster case. There's also launching the novel photos. There's photos for a text preview that students went through to actually preview the text. There's a video there that's been put together, that 4-5 class. And it's interesting because as Rebecca was saying, we're talking about those anticipated challenges with students. One of the things that one of the teachers expressed is like, you know, my kids, they really struggle with writing. They really don't have the stamina sometimes to communicate through writing. And oftentimes what I hear is like, all right, we're going to do a journal or we're going to do a reflective piece. And they go, oh, how long does it have to be? How many sentences, right? And so as we went through and did this work with their reflective journals and some of the work that they did in their thinking maps and even just an open sort of journal after they'd completed this work, is we found really profound reflection from these students, sharing really intimate things and connections that they had made to the text. So we wanted to include them there in terms of that student work sample. And one of the teachers said, nobody asked me how many words it has to be. Nobody asked me how many sentences it had to be, because from that cultural relevance lens, they really connected with what they were reading, and they wanted to express that in writing. Even if the sentence structure isn't always perfect, even if they weren't really sure how to spell that word, you can still read through those student responses and that student work and understand and get a better idea of how they connected to this text. So we're going to say 15 minutes just for folks to explore. Folks online, we already put that link in the chat so folks can connect to it that way as well. We'll come back together and share sort of what did you click on, what did you notice, questions you have, and then we'll kind of come back for a whole group, both in-person and virtual conversation. All right? Yes. And for folks online and folks in person, we're going to put the bit.ly back up. I'm like, oh. So.
Okay, we would love to hear what you clicked on. What did you find? What questions do you still have? What are you thinking about as far as UDL, culturally and linguistically relevant teaching?
So,
Yes.
at our site, we're at a high school, and we have our history department, which I feel every site I've been at, they a little bit of stuck in history, so to say, because they teach history, right? So what they do is the best way of teaching possible, and so where our brains was like, we want change in our history department, and kind of asking how they're using, or if they've ever heard of universal design lessons, and if they, like, what are their thoughts on it, they've looked into it, and kind of just let them come to their own conclusions instead of, pushing them towards it, was kind of our initial thoughts. And we come from an EL, high population of EL students, and the whole thing from this morning, like, are we creating trauma by dictating to them? I think we are, versus allowing them to develop their own language and giving them the opportunity to do that. So that's kind of our takeaway at our own site.
I wish we could come back and hear how that went.
Some people were really stuck in their turnkey, this is how I do things now, rather than, so it's pretty much an old style directive style.
I think we could say that could be true of other content areas as
Sure.
well, right? Like, this is the canon, this is the literature that I teach, right? I don't necessarily want to give that up. But how do we start going through and looking for ways to pair text, to add text to what we're doing with students so that we can be culturally responsive?
One thing that our coordinator of restorative practices and I worked on is how do we incorporate restorative practices into history, and it's making me think about that quite a bit, where we take a look at a historical event and then we go through the affective questions, like, what did you think when you first realized what happened during this event? What impact did this have on the people at the time? What impact is it still having? It's another great way to kind of disrupt that one narrative about historical events, or just that I'm going to teach this event to you from one perspective and we're all going to memorize, kind of the key details, the main events, and move on. Anybody else? Yes.
I just thought, these are just incredibly rich lessons, and they really do empower the learner, give agency, kind of following, like, Shelley was saying in her presentation, and you just see how the UDL and, cultural relevance and linguistic relevance, for that matter, work hand in hand. And even just building in the choice, beyond just, exposing kids to different aspects of history, different kinds of characters, and being empathetic for, somebody in that position. Just offering the choice too on top of it, I think really does kind of create agency for the learner. So I'm really impressed. I'm wondering how much, did you know these teachers before? I saw you in the classroom in the pictures, and so you supported them.
Yeah, so we had been instructional coaches in that district prior to coming to the county office, and my daughter was actually in the 4th grade class, so it was super fun to come in and be able to do that. And for the kids, knowing that Mendez versus Westminster happened a couple of miles down the freeway from where we were sitting, and their questions were like, well, this doesn't still happen, right? And we're like, does it? Doesn't it? And even just the difference between the two schools that we were able to do this at, one of the schools is like the STEAM magnet. A lot of money has been invested in that school. Another school is one of their more kind of struggling Title I schools. And the kids just even noticing the difference between their schools was like, kind of started a lot of conversations and a lot of questions from the kids about what does equal mean, right? And how can we disrupt some of that? So the conversations that the kids were having were blowing us away. It was awesome.
Yes, and so I was definitely made a connection to our keynote speaker this morning when he was talking about giving students the opportunity to speak to power, right? And so in the actual book for Separate is Never Equal, it has these illustrations of students who were sent to a Mexican school, right, and the conditions at the Mexican school. And so you can't really see there. Hopefully you can zoom in and see it on your computer if you're with us here online. But it shows that the school had a barbed wire fence next to a cow farm, and that there was cow poop all over. And the kids were just, it's giggly, the word, poop, whatever. They're going through, they're journaling it. But it's interesting that this school also has a geese situation where the geese love to migrate on their school playground. And the kids really instantly made a connection to that. And they were like, hold on, wait a minute. How in the 1940s are we saying it's not okay for kids to have that playground conditions? And we have a significant goose poop problem here. And there were a bunch of fifth graders who were like, I need a piece of paper. I want to write a letter to the principal, right? Speak action to power. And they were really sort of adamant because they made a connection. Are the conditions exactly the same as they were there? No, but they were very clear on, what, my cousin goes to school down the street and the goose don't poop at their school, right? Like just these very literal things, but they were like, this is not equitable, right? This isn't justice. Why is this an issue? Why don't I have the freedom to play soccer in this way? But just through those conversations, the students were really able to make connections. And I think one of the things that were super powerful in the class that we did this particular activity in, we didn't structure it too much. And I know there's definite value in a partner A and a partner B situation, but if you kind of watch the video of what was going on in that class, we sort of honored the cultural context of those students, of how they speak to each other, right? It was not I'm going to take a turn and you're going to take a turn. I was like, no, don't put that on the poster. No, he was saying this. And so there was shouting, there was dialogue, there was overlap, but every single one of those groups met that objective of what is happening in the story, what are words you don't know, the vocabulary, what questions do you have, right? They were able to manage being successful in the task, sometimes because as educators we got out of the way and trusted them to go forth and do it. And then as we came back together and shared out, giving them the opportunity to sort of speak to those things and the lessons that they learned in that and the connections that they made. Other thoughts, comments, questions, please?
I really liked that game, the path.
Yes, the game board.
Yeah, the game board. It kind of showed how to design a universally designed lesson, because I think that as someone who is trying to help support teachers,
Yes.
the whole concept of changing how you look at lesson designs to think about your entire class and what they bring, opportunities and gifts that kids all can bring, helps to give them at least a starting point. And even to break it down into first choose one part you would change in your lesson design, right? So the whole concept of changing and doing universal designs, like just immobilizing them. So, but if you take pieces of it for at least see what this path could look like, could really be a game changer. Because if you look at the framework, that by itself is not helpful, right? If you think about it like, oh, you didn't do this, and now you got to go back, or you can take this little other path, you have another little path in there, and goes in different directions.
Right, so for the folks at home, the comment was really around sort of this game board, right? Like some of our students would be like, what's a game board? Like it's not online, it's not digital, right? But in that space, and so you'll see sort of this color-coded game board matches the color coding on our lesson template very intentionally, because you could just start exactly as you just shared, in that we can just start with maybe one of these areas to sort of try out. Sometimes it's like, oh, I have to do that whole lesson plan. I have to redesign everything that I do. No, maybe we can just have a conversation about how we're going to select our central text. What's going to be the text we want to use? What's the text that we always use? What's some text that we can actually add in, right? How do we start to have conversations around diverse texts and sort of expanding the library, classroom library, school library, the library that kids see in their K-12 experience, right? To make it a little bit more inclusive so that they have that right to education and to see who they are.
I was just going to add to your point, as coaches and people who teach teachers, when we go to trainings on UDL and CLRT, it's kind of like, oh, it's a buffet, it's a salad bar, it's representation. And when people get back to their classrooms, that can feel overwhelming, right? How do I create a buffet or a salad bar for every content area every day? And how do I make sure that every identity is represented? I mean, we saw it with Shelley, all those tiny pieces of the pie, how do we make sure all that's represented? And so when we sat down to kind of take that game board and create the lesson plan template, it was, how can we make this manageable and tangible and actionable for teachers? Because it's not always a buffet, it's not always a salad bar, and it's not even just about representation, it's intentionality, right? What are we doing with the information that we know about our students, and designing lessons at the forefront to get them where we need them to go academically, to help them see themselves in the curriculum and the history, and to develop their own ideas about what they think is happening and what they think is important. And so that's where this whole thing was born. And then we're like, we got to try this with kids. Where can we find children?
No more theory. Let's get into the actual practical application of it.
Yeah. So it was fun. Anybody else? Yes. That's a great question, and I'll answer from the STEAM magnet school. So it's kind of just become the way they do business, particularly in that grade, and they're trying to vertically articulate that with the grade levels above them and below them. As a STEAM magnet school, it's kind of, it's not new, right? It's just a more intentional way to look at things. Whereas the other school, that teacher calls Audra, I think every day, to still have those coaching conversations and to ask questions and to continue that work. But my understanding is that it's still hers, right? She's carrying that torch and trying to spread that across the school, but I'll let Audra share more about that.
Yes, so the question was sort of how much work did this take and how was kind of the follow-up happening? I'll say we probably had 2 Zooms with the teachers in preparation for this work because they're, capable educators who believe in this work. So we kind of got a chance to sort of give the structure and then turn them loose and then come back and sort of revisit that conversation. Kelly, who Rebecca was referring to, was like, yes, I'm super excited. We're going to do this. I have ideas on how to build it out. And then she got moved to 2nd grade. And so she's like, no, right? But even though she's like, I have to find different texts now because I'm not going to do Mendes versus Westminster. But part of it is she's like, I really want to go back and do it because part of her new 2nd grade team, they do Famous Americans in the spring. And it just sort of has the ideas bubbling with her like, what famous American books do we have in our library? Oh, there's 17 of them about Abraham Lincoln and 13 about Martin Luther King. Guess what everybody's writing about? So like in anticipation of that work, how do we start structuring things? So I feel like once you sort of teach this way or plan this way, it kind of goes back to what Rebecca was saying. It just kind of becomes the way that you do things or the lens that you use to look at things. All right. Oh my goodness. I can't believe it. That was an hour. Thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate you physically here, being here, and everybody who joined us online. Thank you all so much.